What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we're covering one of Arjun Erigaisi's latest and greatest games. This one is Arjun versus Amin Tabatabaei. Hopefully I said that right. From the 2024 Chenai Grand Masters, which is happening right now. And here we go. In the game, Amin opens 1e4 best by test, and Arjun does go 1e5 with the open games on the board. Now, knight to f3 puts pressure on that pawn. Knight c6 does defend the pawn. And now here, Amin does opt for the Italian opening with the move 3, bishop c4, one of the main lines for white these days, along with the Roy Lopez with the move 3, bishop b5. Now here, both sides follow the absolute main line of the Italian opening for several moves. So here, Arjun, knight to f6, the two knights defense, putting pressure on that pawn on e4. Now white does have the option of either d3 defending or knight to g5, the fried liver attack. In the game, he does go d3, this being the main line, just defending, and now Arjun does go bishop c5, the main Italian move for black as well, getting that bishop on this very important diagonal here, putting pressure on f2. Now here, white, he castles, short castles on the board, and Arjun does go d6, simply supporting that pawn on e5. Now, theoretically, he is ready for the move knight to e5, chasing that light square bishop on c4. Therefore, here, white is going to go c3, and the idea being, if black goes knight to a5, again, that d6 pawn does defend e5, therefore knight takes e5 is not a possibility. Then white can go b4, gaining space on the queen side and forking both the knight and the bishop. Then after knight takes c4, then b takes c5, white is going to be doing just fine. So with that in mind, knight to e5, no longer a good idea for black. Now here in this position, Arjun has three main moves. The main idea is to give that bishop on c5 a good retreat square and to get out of the way of a future d4 advance from white. Of course, that being one of white's main ideas in the Italian. So here, the main moves for black are going to be bishop b6, a6, and a5. And they all have their subtle nuances. In the game, Arjun does go for the main line, a6, intending perhaps bishop a7 on the next move. Now here, white, he expands on the queen side, a4 on the board, and it turns out this is the main line for white these days in the Italian in response to an early a6. The idea being you want to gain space on the queen side with a b4 advance, and this extra space on the queen side does give you a chance to fight for the advantage. That is one of the main reasons the Italian opening is so popular these days, along with the Roy Lopez opening after 1e4. Now here, Arjun, instead of bishop a7 immediately, he does go h6, stopping bishop g5 and knight g5 ideas permanently. And in response, Amin does go rook to e1, continuing development. Now his plan may be, for example, b4 or knight d2 to f1, then g3, a pretty typical idea for white in the Italian and the Roy Lopez. Now here, Arjun, bishop a7 on the board, the standard move for black again in this a6 line, getting out of the way of a future b4 or d4 advance, and b4 certainly could be coming on the next move, and that is what we see from white. Here, b4, gaining space on the queen side. Again, so far, both sides have followed the absolute main line. However, this is where the game gets exciting. Here, the main line for black is to go castles, then rook to e8, and then bishop e6, challenging that white bishop on c4. That is the absolute main line. The lines go very, very long and very deep. However, instead, in this position, Arjun, being the very aggressive attacking player that he is, of course, he is going to go for an aggressive attacking line in this position. And of course, he does start the attack with the move g5, gaining space on the king side, threatening g4, threatening to knock back that knight off the f3 square. And then the plan is h5, h4, and then maybe even g3 in the future. So Arjun already going for a very aggressive attacking idea on the king side. And how is white going to respond? Well, it turns out here, the best response to the flank attack, that being g5, is the attack in the center. And here, the strongest idea for Amin is the move d4, but these lines are insanely complicated. The main line here for white is d4, then black goes g4, knocking back the knight, and instead of moving the knight, you actually want to go b5, gaining space on the queen side. That is the top engine line. Again, those lines are just insanely complicated. Both sides can lose their knights on f3 and b6. Again, the lines go very deep there. Instead, in the game, Amin, he was surprised by Arjun's opening choice in this game, and instead of d4, he does go bishop to e3, challenging that black bishop on a7. And now, in theory, this is a decent move. That bishop is very, very strong, and you do want to restrict it as soon as you can. Of course, that bishop putting a lot of pressure on that f2 point. However, this move turns out to be very slow, and here Arjun, he does have a couple of good ways to capitalize on this mistake. Now, the strongest move is going to be g4 immediately driving back that knight. However, instead, in the game, Arjun does take on e3 first. So, bishop takes, then rook takes from white, recapturing with the rook, F takes e3 is also possible. However, that would damage the pawn structure on the king side a little bit, so rook takes a very logical move here. And now Arjun does go g4. g4 on the board, gaining space on the king side, and of course, driving back that knight. And the follow-up idea at some point is going to be h5, then h4, and maybe even g3, again, opening lines in front of the white king. Now, the drawback of going bishop takes e3 before going g4 here for Arjun is the knight on f3 does have access to the e1 square. For example, if black did not take on e3, then the rook would be on the e1 square. Therefore, after g4, the white knight would only have access to the d2 square as a good retreat square. Instead here, knight to e1 is possible. That is what's played in the game. And here, the knight is a little bit closer to the king side. And beyond that, the other knight has access to the d2 square. So here, Arjun, a slightly inaccurate move, which does spoil a little bit of his advantage in this position. And here, both sides have roughly equal chances. All right, Arjun, as expected, h5 is the next move. Again, continuing to push those pawns down the board. Again, the idea being h4, then g3. All right, now Amin, he does understand the flank attack is best responded to by an attack in the center. And with that in mind, he does break here with the move d4, a very strong move. And now look at this. The black king on e8, Arjun's king, it is still stuck in the center. It is opposite the white rook on the e3 square. If this e-file gets blown open, then his king will be incredibly vulnerable. Therefore, with that in mind, e takes d4 is obviously not the right idea for black. That would be absolutely suicide after, say, a future e5 advance. So instead here, Arjun, he just continues the attack on the king side with the move h4. And we'll cover that in just a second. Now, of course, that wasn't the only option. Black can castle, then go knight h7 and queen g5. He can also go knight d7, then queen g5. Again, preparing the attack a little more, but Arjun, being the ultra-aggressive player that he is, of course, h4 is going to be the move in this position. Getting those pawns on g4 and h4. What a position we have already in move 13 in the Italian opening. All right, now, it is Amin's turn. What should he be doing right here in this position? Well, according to the engine, the strongest move is knight to d2, getting the other knight over to the defense of the king side. However, instead of that in the game, bishop e2 was the move, putting some pressure on that pawn on g4, but it turns out this is quite a bit weaker. The bishop not really doing a whole lot on e2 as that pawn on g4 is sufficiently defended for now. Now, the main idea is knight d7 and knight h7 are not possibilities here. However, Arjun, he does find a perfectly fine way to continue the attack. Now, the engine here actually says you can go for g3 immediately. Those lines are insane. Instead, Arjun goes for a very creative way to get that queen to the g-file. He starts queen to e7. Again, the plan Arjun would like to do is either knight d7 or knight h7, and then queen g5. Of course, that would hang the pawn on g4 immediately, it being attacked twice by the bishop and the queen, and only defended once by the bishop here if the knight moves. Therefore, instead, Arjun, he's going to go queen e7, then queen to f8, and then queen g7. So, let's see how it all plays out. Here, in this position, Amin, he does gain space on the king side, d5 on the board, and now we have sort of a King's Indian defense sort of pawn structure. Those pawns in the center on d5 and e4 and e6 or d6 and e5 are exactly what you would have in the King's Indian. And just like in the King's Indian, here black is attacking on the king side with those g and h pawns. And white, his plan is basically c4, c5, again in the spirit of perhaps the bayonet attack of the classical variation of the King's Indian defense. So now here, that knight on c6 is being attacked. Where is it going to go? It can go to both d8 and b8. In the game, knight to b8 was the move for Arjun. And now here, Amin, knight d2, bringing the other knight into the game, a very solid move. Now here, Arjun, he does continue his plan, queen to f8. Again, the idea being queen g7 on the next move. And from there, that pawn will be sufficiently defended on g4, and perhaps the follow-up move will be g3, pushing that pawn down to the g3 square. Now here, Amin, what should he be doing here? Well, it turns out you have to strike immediately on the queen side. The only good plan here for Amin is going to be c4, then c5 as fast as you can. For example, c4, then Arjun, maybe he can go g3, but even if he does that, c5 will be the correct follow-up move. It is just that important to attack immediately here. All right, here, Amin, knight to f1. He does defend instead of going c4. This is a slightly inaccurate move, as you can see by the eval bar on the left shooting down. Now white's advantage is very, very minimal in this position. And Arjun, he continues to prepare the attack. Queen to h6, instead of queen g7. Arjun finding a very interesting square for the queen, and now take a look at this. The queen is pressuring that rook on the e3 square. For example, if g3 gets played and say f takes g3, that rook would only be defended by the knight on the f1 square. Therefore, if that knight moves in the future, then queen takes e3 could be a very real possibility. So watch out for that in the coming moves here. All right, Amin, he finally gets his queenside play going. c4, threatening c5 on the next move. That is absolutely the right idea here for Amin. However, here Arjun, he just goes for on the king side. g3 is the move, blowing open the king side once and for all. And this is the first mini climax of the game. Of course, as usual, the computer finds other ideas. It likes the idea of a5 in the spirit of black side of the bayonet attack of the king's Indian defense, but instead g3 on the board for Arjun. Now here we have f takes g3, h takes g3, and then in this position, Amin has to find the right follow-up. Here, almost everything is booby-trapped. For example, if you go rook takes g3, then knight takes e4, wins that pawn on e4, and Arjun would have a massive advantage. Instead, if you go h takes g3, obviously that does open up the h-file. Queen to h1 would be very dangerous. Instead, if you go knight takes g3 here, then the rook on the e3 square does hang, that being the idea of queen to h6 earlier by Arjun. So Arjun really planning ahead in this game. All right, instead of those moves here, Amin, he does play the move h3, avoiding all of those traps. This is the best idea. However, now Arjun, in the spirit of the king's Indian defense, in the king's Indian, whenever you have that pawn on g3 and the white pawn goes to h3, your light squared bishop is threatening to sacrifice on h3, and bishop takes h3 will be a very real threat in the coming moves. All right, now, Arjun Erigaisi, knight b to d7 is the move, developing the other knight back into the game. Now here, Amin, c5, gaining space on the queen side, potentially being ready to sacrifice a pawn. For example, d takes, b takes, and knight takes would win a pawn, but Amin knows he has to open up lines on the queen side as quickly as possible, and if that means sacrificing a pawn, so be it. Now, in the game, Arjun, he did not take on c5. Obviously, he is 100% committed to attacking on the king side. Therefore, with that in mind, knight to f8, intending perhaps knight g6, then knight to f4. That would be a very dangerous placement for the knight. All right, now, c takes d6, c takes on the board, opening up the c-file. This is a very good development for white. And now, how does he want to continue the attack on the queen side? This is very important to get this right. Here, the computer finds, as usual, a lot of really cool ideas. For example, rook to a3 is my personal favorite move in this position. The rook lift on the third rank, and the rook will be defending the king side indirectly with this rook on e3. Instead of that, in the game, queen to c1 is the move for Amin, lining up the queen with the c-file. And now, for example, queen to c7 could be a good move in the future. The queen jumping into the very vulnerable c7 square, threatening queen takes d6, and so on. All right, now here, Arjun, he is ready to go for the attack. And if you like puzzles, pause the video and find the key move for Arjun in this position. All right, I hope you found it. The key move here, of course, is going to be the bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes h3, the king's Indian defense style move, giving up that bishop for that pawn on the h3 square, and the idea being you simply have to blow open that blockade on the king side. Now here, g takes h3 is the move for Amin, and then knight to g6, Arjun not taking that pawn on h3 right away, instead the idea being knight to f4, and then maybe knight takes h3, taking the pawn with the knight instead. All right, here Amin, how should he be defending in this position? It is so important to find the right move. Well, it turns out knight takes g3 is the right way to capture the pawn on the g3 square. Instead, rook takes g3 is the move played in the game, and this is quite a bit weaker. Here, Arjun just jumps in with the knight to f4, continuing his plan, and very importantly, avoiding that queen trade. The queens were attacking each other on h6 and c1, but after knight to f4, that diagonal is blocked. Therefore, the queens are going to stay on the game for at least a little bit longer. All right, now Amin is being attacked. The move in the game for him is queen to e3, sliding his queen over to the king side. And here Arjun, he does bail out to something resembling an equal endgame. He takes on h3 with the knight. Knight takes h3. Then we have rook takes, queen takes, and rook takes h3. And now let's slow down and do inventory here. Here in this position, both sides have about 4 to 5 pawns. Arjun, he has an extra rook. He has 2 rooks versus the 1 rook of Amin, but Amin has 3 minor pieces versus the 1 of Arjun. That means Arjun has the rook and the pawn versus the extra 2 minor pieces of Amin, and that means the material balance, believe it or not, in this crazy position is roughly equal. So we have a roughly equal endgame on our hands, but trust me, this endgame is unlike anything you've ever seen. You cannot miss what Arjun does here. All right, bishop f3 on the board, defends that pawn on e4, and of course the bishop being defended by the knight on e1 square, therefore rook takes f3, not a possibility yet. All right, rook c8, Arjun capitalizing on the open c file with the rook, threatening perhaps rook c3, or maybe a rook to c2 as well. Now here, rook b1 on the board for Amin, threatening maybe b5. Now we have rook to c3, flying in with the rook is Arjun. Knight d2, further defends that bishop on f3. Of course, rook takes was being threatened. And now king to e7 for Arjun, centralizing the king. Now a5, gain space on the queen side, and knight d7 for Arjun. Arjun trying to find a better square for the knight, and believe it or not, that knight is heading to f8, then g6, then maybe f4 in the spirit of his other knight earlier in the game. All right, king to f2 for Amin, knight f8, Arjun continuing his plan, and then b5, gaining space on the queen side. Amin knows he needs some form of counterplay, so for now the threat, for example, is either b takes and then rook to b6, or if a takes, rook takes, and then threatening rook takes b7. So Amin, he is getting counterplay here. All right, knight g6 for Arjun. Arjun again threatening knight to f4, jumping in with the knight. Now we have b takes, and here Amin, he plays a somewhat passive move, bishop g2, sliding back the bishop and threatening the rook. All right, rook to h6 retreats the rook, rook b7 check hits the king, king to f8, and then finally rook b6. Now Amin is threatening both rook takes a6 and d6. If he wins either of those pawns, he will have a pass pawn in the center or on the queen side, and that would be very dangerous. All right, here Arjun, he does not try to defend. There is simply no way to defend that pawn on a6. Therefore, knight to f4 is the move. Arjun jumping in with the knight, continuing his attacking plan for this game. Now, rook takes a6. Amin now has that pass pawn on the queen side, but Arjun, he's not phased. Rook to a3, threatening both rook to a2 and putting pressure on that pawn on a5. Now, rook to a8 hits the king. King g7, a6, advancing the pawn down the board. And now rook to a2, threatening rook takes d2, winning that knight on d2, and beyond that, pinning the knight on d2 to the king. The knight cannot move. All right, knight f3 defends the other knight, but here Arjun, he finds a way to open up a new line of attack. f5 on the board, threatening f takes e4, and if black takes on f5, then ideas like e4 will be a possibility, as again, that knight on d2 is pinned. Knight takes e4 would not be a possibility. And from there, that pawn would threaten the other defender of the knight, therefore one of these knights would be lost. All right, you cannot take on f5. Therefore, rook to a7 is the move for Amin. King to f8, rook a8, king g7, rook to a7. And here, if Arjun wanted a draw, he could go king f8, king g7, allowing rook a8, rook a7, and so on. But instead, he fights on for a win. King to f6. Arjun fighting in this equal endgame for the win at all costs. And his decision has paid off here in this position. Immediately after rejecting that draw offer, here Amin, he makes a big mistake. In this position, the move you have to make is rook to d7, giving up that pawn on a6 if Arjun wants it. The idea being rook d7, then rook takes, then bishop to f1, putting pressure on the rook on a6, and there's no good way to maintain the defense of the d6 pawn. For example, if you go, say, rook to b6, then knight to c4 will be the move, putting pressure on the rook once again, and that pawn on d6, no matter what, will fall. Instead of that, in the game, Amin, he does go bishop to f1 immediately, intending rook d7 on the next move. However, this turns out to be the wrong order of the moves, and here Arjun, he just takes the pawn on e4, f takes e4, and now again, if that knight on f3 moves, then the knight on d2 will fall. But at the same time, if you don't move the knight, then that knight on f3 will fall. So here Amin, he is in quite the pickle. All right, bishop c4 on the board for Amin, then rook to c2, pressuring that bishop. Now rook d7 threatens rook takes d6 check. That would be a very good development for Amin. But now rook to h3, threatening that knight on f3 with the rook. Of course, rook takes f3 is a real threat, as again, the knight on d2 is being pinned currently. So Arjun opting not to go e takes f3 immediately, as he can apply even more pressure with the rook on the h3 square. An absolutely brilliant idea by Arjun. Now, king to e3, the king trying to run out of these weird pins he's in, but these rooks on both sides are just so menacing. All right, Arjun, f takes e3 is the move, finally capturing that knight on f3. But now knight to e4 for Amin, jumping in with the knight. King to f5 is the move, getting out of the attack. But now, once again, knight takes d6, once again hitting the king with check, and once again, that king must move. So, king g6 on the board. Now, bishop to f1 pressures the rook on the h3 square. Amin fighting for his life, but now, here Arjun, he ignores the threat and puts his under rook under attack. Rook to e2, an absolutely brilliant move, and here's the idea. If you take that rook on e2 with the bishop, bishop takes e2, then f takes e2 will be checked as the rook has a discovered attack on the king. And I do want to show you real fast how this line goes. Here Arjun, he technically has a mate in 8 moves from this position. All right, bishop takes is the only move. Then f takes again, opening up the attack on the king with the rook. Then the king goes to d2. Then you fly with the rook, rook to d3, forcing either king to c2, c1, or e1. Let's use e1. This one's a mate in 6, but e1's a more logical defensive move, trying to defend that pawn from promoting. Here, king to e1. Then you go rook d1, the pawn being defended by the knight. Therefore, king to f2 is forced. King f2 on the board. Then you go e1, promote to a queen. King goes to f3, and then finally rook d3 would be checkmate. So for that reason, here after rook to e2 check from Arjun, the brilliant move, in this position, Amin, he resigned on the spot to Arjun Erigaisi. There is just no stopping that pawn from promoting. There is no stopping that mate. He knows what he's beat, and he simply gives up here in this position. Wow, what a game by Arjun Erigaisi, the man on fire, the man of the hour. He may even be on track to surpass Magnus Carlsen at the rate he's going. He is like a giant black hole. He is just warping the chess universe around him right now. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where Arjun Erigaisi absolutely destroys Magnus Carlsen after he played an insane queen sacrifice against him. Again, Arjun defends the queen sacrifice and ends up destroying Magnus Carlsen. If you haven't seen that game, you will love it, so check it out. And I will see you in the next video.